Hi, welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name's Adam Hanlon. I'd like to introduce you to our expert on all things underwater, Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Adam. Nice introduction there. Thank you.
So you're welcome. And today we're going to talk about triggering your strobes. And I'd like straight away to ask Alex to explain how we can trigger our strobes.
Oh, goodness. Well, for me, I guess there are three main options for triggering your strobes as an underwater photographer. I think it's important to start, though, by saying that we can't all choose between these three because a lot of the camera systems are limited to just one of them, both either at the camera end or the housing or the strobe end. So, but the three main options are probably most widespread these days, particularly driven by compact cameras and some of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, is using the built-in or pop-up flash of the camera as the triggering point, triggering the flash guns down fiber optic cables. Oh. The second option is to have some sort of flash trigger inside the housing. Often these are built into the housing these days. Sometimes they push onto the hot shoe of the camera, and those create an LED, using LEDs creates a signal that will fire the flash. They can be manual, but most of them tend to be TTL these days. Maybe we'll get into why that is. I don't have the best opinion of that. And then the third technique is the more traditional one, which is using electronic cables. And there are, I think, three main cables that I see on the market. There's the old Nikonos style cables. There are S6 cables, and then the Icolite cables as well, which I think are the three main cables that are around. So there's not even just one type of cabling. I guess it's also worth pointing out that fiber optics, although they all tend to use the same fiber, the termination points, there's also variation within underwater photography. So, and these are actually quite frustrations for photographers on trips, because even if you're on a trip with other photographers, you may have a problem with your electronic sync cable or your fiber optic cable, and other people on board of your boat or your, on the liverboard or in the resort might have spares, but those spares won't fit your housing. And I would love there to be more standardization across underwater photography with that. I think it would make it so much easier in the field. Even for example, Nauticam, whose t-shirt I'm wearing today, even though they use different fiber optic connectors on their big housings and small housings. Yeah. So even if you're you and your friend or partner or buddy both use their housings but have different levels of housings, you might even need completely different fibers and things. And I wish there was more standardization on that. Anyway, that's plenty of introduction. Adam, what do you use on your housing?
Well, I just mentioned briefly that there actually is now quite a few manufacturers are now producing fiber optic cables that use an adapter. So the standard fiber optic cable now that you purchase from HouseShot or Nauticam, I think in on as well, I may have that wrong, now has an adapter that allows you to use it with the most common types of connection. It's by no means universal. So there is a certain amount of standardization creeping into the industry. I tend to use now fiber optic triggering using an internal circuit board. So my housings are equipped with internal boards which have their own battery. And
those are your CCAM housings I can see behind you.
Yeah, those are the CCAM housings, but I also have used them with Nauticam as well and others. They're actually internal in the housing, they're built in, and the board inside the housing attaches to the camera with a hot shoe, and the hot shoe obviously then the camera triggers, and that produces a pulse of light with an LED, and that light then travels down the fiber optic to the strobe. And although I do have some strobes, I still have some strobes that require wire triggering. My preferred option now is to use a board and fiber optic. How about you, Alex? What are you using?
Well, I have quite a few cameras. With my main cameras, I'm generally using electronic cables. And that's partly because I have plenty of them, and for me, they've proved very reliable. Most of them are, most of a decade old, same cables I use trip after trip, and they're absolutely fine, and they're not particularly expensive to buy. No. I think one of the things that really surprises people is that fiber optics, well, they're relatively simple, but the underwater photography world never misses a chance to charge you loads of money for something. And fiber optic cables can be more expensive to buy than electronic cables. I guess there's maybe less demand, and electronic cables seems to have so much more manufacturing and materials in it.
I've just bought a couple of fiber optic ones, and absolutely, they're no cheaper.
And I've found them very reliable. So, and also I have to say I've been able to buy quite a lot of CNC cables as well secondhand, because people have like gone over to fiber and they're like, I've got these old cables, who wants them for 10 quid, 10 British pounds, and which is not very much, worth less and less every day. And I've been able to, to pick up a lot of stuff secondhand, and it carries on working for ages. So I use electronic cables because my main flash guns that I use for my photography are Cam 150s, which is a flash gun they introduced probably 15 years ago now. And I've had them for about 10 years, and they're real workhorse strobes, and we'll probably talk about our gear in a future episode of this. And just really take a professional workload, really easy to live with in the field. And so those are my main strobes, but they're electronic only. So my housings are based around those. The strobes that I use for macro and cold water are smaller strobes. I used to use in-on strobes. I now use retro strobes for that, and those can take both fiber optic and electronic. The newer retros are electronic, are fiber optic only. So I kind of have a bit of a mix in my gear selection. I have some strobes that are electronic only, and some strobes that are fiber only, and so that makes me have to shoot both ways. The other reason I guess I don't use much fiber is I don't have a really nice trigger built into my housing. When I got my housing, I wasn't using any strobes that needed fiber optics, and as a result, I didn't get a nice board built in, and I've got a couple that I can fit in quite easily and use fiber optics, but that just takes a little bit of time switching over the housing. So most of the time I'm using that. That said, with my Micro Four Thirds cameras, they have flash guns, and I use the flash to trigger. I think one of the big downsides of using the pop-up flash to trigger is, well, there's a few downsides which I think are worth mentioning. One is it can really heat up a housing. And particularly the plastic polycarbonate housings, they can get very hot and become quite humid when you use that pop-up flash a lot. It's less of an issue with an aluminium housing that sort of conducts the heat away. You don't tend to have the fogging issues. But the time when most people who've been using their pop-up flash for years, they suddenly realize they don't want to use it anymore, is the moment you go on a big animal trip and it's action, action, action. And suddenly they were quite happy shooting along, one frame, okay, that's that shot. Wait a second, that's that shot. The moment you have big animal action and people want to go dagger, 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 as I suppose past with tiger shark or whatever the trip is, suddenly people realize the limitations of pop-up flash, and that's with that ability to shoot fast. And both electronic flash guns and flash triggers are much better at being able to allow you to have that really fast frame rate. And I think that's something that people realize as they get into that type of photography. If you just do macro shooting or you just do reef wide angle shooting, you're probably never going to run into that issue. But the moment you go on these big animal trips, the number of times I've had people join me on workshop trips and go, oh my God, I can't shoot. And it's never happened before. And it's like, well, you've never done this exciting diving before. And suddenly you're seeing, the need for that. So yeah, I think those things influence things.
I think there's a kind of little subset as well. So within the fiber optic with a flash trigger, there is also some units that have an external box which contains a flash trigger, which it goes onto the camera's hot shoe. So it's not built into the housing; it's a separate trigger, and that's an interesting take on it as well. My experience of them in general is, although they tend to be fairly reliable, it's another thing to go wrong. And it's another thing to forget. It's another thing that has batteries. And I think we're going to return to the idea of reliability in a minute. But it's another thing that batteries can die. We can leave it switched on in your bag, all that kind of stuff, which can kill the batteries. And it's a thing to forget to switch on when you close the housing up, all that kind of stuff. So in general, it's another complication that creates sometimes problems. But again, it's another solution. I know, for example, some of the bigger Canon cameras, that's the solution that most people are using rather than built in. So it's a kind of subset. It's the same process. You've got a flash trigger producing a flash that goes down a fiber optic cable. So ultimately, mechanically, it's the same, but it's a slightly different way of doing it.
Yeah, I think I think these days as well, the guys that are developing these trigger boards are selling them onto the manufacturers, who are then fitting them directly into their housings. So people tend to have them built in, whereas I think particularly in the early days, it was often an aftermarket thing, maybe produced by the manufacturer that would slot into the housing. So some of those older ones. I think that you do raise a really important point, that it is another thing to go wrong. It's another thing to be looking after. And I've seen plenty of flash triggers run out of batteries during trips, and the person who owns them hasn't had any more batteries for it on the trip.
Yeah.
and we've had to, go around the liverboard and see if anyone's got any spare batteries that in some weird button battery size that, of which there's like 5 million, and you try and find some that will work with it, and we can eventually get them working or figure out some other way to fire things. So yeah, definitely, I think that's a really interesting area with if you are in a position to have this choice. And I realize, lots of people have cameras that don't have pop-up flashes, or maybe have a housing that doesn't have space for a flash trigger, or have a housing that doesn't have a hot shoe, so they can't have electronic flash. Yeah. So a lot of people don't have the choice. But if you have the choice, I think the reliability of each system is a really interesting one. And I think that, well, I was writing on Wetpixel this week, actually, that I think I'm in quite a privileged position. I do 350 dives on average every year. This year it's less, but I do about 350 dives each year. And nearly these days, for about the last 5 years, pretty much all those dives have been on workshops. And on those workshops, I'm typically joined by 15 to 20 photographers, depends on the trip. All of whom are, coming to me the moment they have any problem with their system. So as a result, I sort of totted up the numbers, and I think it's about between about 5,000 and 8,000 dives each year are done as underwater photographers under my sort of eye.
Yeah.
And so it gives me a really interesting insight into what's reliable and what's not.
Yeah.
And I can say absolutely that I see as many problems with people triggering fiber optically as electronically.
Yeah.
And I know that people say, oh, fiber optics, it's bound to be more reliable. It can't flood. You're not risking the housing. You're not risking the cable. One, I've never seen a housing flood through a flash socket. They don't flood. No, the flash sockets are sealed. So if a flash socket floods, maybe the flash socket might die,
yeah.
but it's not going to ever flood your housing. So as a risk point for the housing, it's nothing to worry about. Yes, they can flood and it can stop the flash working. Typically, I have to say that nearly always on a trip, they're very rescuable. You can clean those flash sockets out, you can clean the contacts of the housing, and they all work really well. So that's one of the things I like about electronic. Although you've got this flood risk, floods don't tend to kill them. So you're really able to get them back to life. I think fiber optics, when they break, they often break permanently, and they can be quite hard to fix in the field the way they break.
Yep.
I think one of the plus points on fiber optics, though, is that taking those spares along with you weigh a lot less.
Yeah.
I know electronic cables are not exactly heavy, but when you start having to take 2 or 3 more on a trip and you're fighting every last gram in your luggage, it does make a really big difference. Whereas fiber optics, easy to take them along.
I think the point we made earlier about expense, though, it's not any cheaper to have 2 fiber optic cables than it is to have 2 electrical cables.
No, yeah, electrical cables, yeah, they and it's strange because if you look at an electrical cable and all the components in it, all the machining in it, surely it should cost many times more than a fiber optic. But I think the underwater photography market knows exactly how much they can get away with charging for that.
And kind of returning to that as well, I think one of the things that's happened, we have fiber optic is fundamentally a fairly simple system, but what we found that a lot of the circuit boards that are being produced have a lot of features on them that possibly photographers don't necessarily always need. And so we end up in a situation where we have a simpler system that's actually become overly complicated due to some of the features that are added to the board. And the obvious one here is, and if you've watched our previous episode about TCL versus manual, you know which camp Alex and I sit in. But certainly, I think there's a really good case for people producing a board that just produces a really good manual exposure. It just produces a flash. And a cheap, simple solution, which then would allow you to carry 2 if you flood the board, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point and very politically stated. I think I'm certainly very frustrated with the fact, and I understand the situation, that all the good fiber optic triggering boards and circuitry all have TTL in. And I don't believe that the market is demanding it. I believe that the guys that make the flash triggers, they have put a lot of hard work into figuring out how to crack those TTL protocols. And that for them is the clever thing they've done. The electronic components you need to make a flash trigger cost a couple of bucks. Yeah. And they're charging, the price for a lot of these flash triggers is several $100s. And you're paying for their expertise in TTL. Yeah. And if they took the TTL off the board, in my opinion, they wouldn't be able to charge as much. So that's why the TTL keeps going back on the board. And the photographers don't really want TTL, and we have to pay for these very expensive flash triggers. And because the flash triggers are expensive, we're then people aren't taking spares. And if they break on trips, they haven't got spares with them. And so that is a real downside of the system. That's a little bit unfair to the flash trigger designers. And I think now we're starting to see them putting some really interesting features on that expand our photography, like high-speed flash sync,
high-speed sync,
things like that. That definitely is worth the money to spend them, to get. And if you have to have TTL capability, so be it. But paying, but yeah, it is what it is in that situation. But I think one of the downsides of that route is because the gear is quite expensive, it stops you taking a spare. So you're opening yourself up to having some potential problems. One of the things I like about fibers, if it goes wrong in the field, it's just an electrical connection. You can find a bit of wire, and even with my awful soldering skills, solder it back together, and your flash gun will work for the trip. And so I like that simplicity. I'm always loath to put more and more complexity in an underwater camera system, especially complexity I don't need, because it's more things to go wrong. But that said, I shoot both fiber optic and fiber optic, and electronic. And as long as they make my flash guns go flash when I press that shutter, that's really all I care about.
And
so
that
for me is the bottom line.
That's really what it's all about. We need to press the shutter and the flashes go bang. That's been a great discussion. Thank you very much, Alex. Where can people see more of your work?
Instagram's a great place to check me out, at Alex Mustard 1 on Instagram. I try and share pictures on there. I've been a bit rubbish at it recently, but there's plenty of old ones on there to look at, and I'll get back on the case soon.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. So thank you all for watching Wetpixel Live. Please feel free to add comments, suggestions, and everything else down below here. And I look forward to seeing you at the next episode.